Listen up, because in 1985, G.I. Joe wasn't just a cartoon. It was pulling in over $150 million a year and had more comic book subscribers than Spider-Man. But here's the thing. By 1992, it was dead. Completely gone. So what the hell happened? How did the biggest action figure line of the 80s go from absolute dominance to total collapse in just 7 years? Look, if you grew up in the 80s, you remember rushing home after school to catch G.I. Joe. You remember those file cards on the back of every figure. You remember knowing is half the battle. But what you probably don't know is the insane business strategy that made it all possible, and the corporate decisions that killed it. In this video, I'm going to show you exactly how G.I. Joe became a cultural phenomenon, why the government actually allowed it to exist in the first place, and the 3 specific mistakes that destroyed the franchise. And I've got to warn you, when you see what happened behind the scenes, you're going to realize that everything you loved about G.I. Joe was basically one giant, perfectly executed commercial. But honestly, that's what made it so damn good. Look, I went deep on this one. Tracked down industry reports, legal filings, and financial records to get the real story. And man, it gets wild. We're talking about regulatory loopholes, corporate panic, and creative decisions that still baffle me to this day. So buckle up, because this isn't just a nostalgia trip. This is a masterclass in how to build a franchise and how to destroy one. The perfect storm. How Reagan made G.I. Joe possible. Alright, so here's something most people don't realize. G.I. Joe, as we knew it in the 80s, shouldn't have existed at all. Throughout the entire 1970s, the FCC, that's the Federal Communications Commission, was all over children's television like a hawk. They had strict rules about what you could advertise to kids, and they absolutely hated the idea of shows that were basically just toy commercials. And for good reason, right? The whole concept sounds sketchy. Make a cartoon whose sole purpose is to sell plastic toys to kids. The FCC saw that as exploitative, manipulative, basically using entertainment as a Trojan horse for advertising. So for most of the 70s, if you were a toy company, you had to play by the rules. You could advertise your toys during cartoons, but you couldn't make the cartoon itself an advertisement. There was a clear line, and the government enforced it. But then, Reagan got elected. And in 1984, something crazy happened. The FCC, under Reagan's administration, just dropped the ban. They formally declined to adopt any standards against what critics were calling program-length commercials. This wasn't some quiet policy change either. This was a deliberate deregulation move that completely transformed children's television overnight. Critics were furious. They literally said that children's television had become the video equivalent of a Toys R Us catalog. And you know what? They were absolutely right. But here's the thing. Whether you think it was ethical or not, this regulatory change created a golden opportunity for toy companies. And Hasbro was ready to capitalize on it. Now, Hasbro wasn't starting from scratch. They owned the G.I. Joe brand. They'd created the original 12-inch action figure back in 1964. Yeah, they literally invented the term action figure because they didn't want to call them dolls. Smart marketing even back then. But by the early 80s, those 12-inch figures were expensive to produce and expensive to buy. Kids wanted something more affordable, and parents wanted something that didn't take up half the toy chest. So Hasbro made a brilliant decision. They shrunk G.I. Joe down to 3.75 inches. Why that specific size? Because that was the exact same size as Kenner's Star Wars figures, which were printing money at the time. But here's where Hasbro showed they weren't just copying, they were innovating. They made their figures better, way better. More articulation than Mattel's Masters of the Universe, more detailed sculpts, better accessories. And here's the kicker, individual file cards with backstories for every single character. Think about that for a second. These weren't just generic army men you bought in a bag at the 5 and dime for $1. Each figure had a name, a specialty, a personality, a hometown. Snake Eyes wasn't just Ninja Guy. He was a commando with a tragic backstory who'd taken a vow of silence. This level of characterization did 2 things. First, it made kids want to collect them all because each one felt unique and special. And second, and this is genius, it changed how the figures were legally classified for import duties. Because each figure was so unique and detailed, they got classified as highly characterized toy figures instead of generic toy soldiers. That's a legal distinction that saved Hasbro millions in taxes. I'm not kidding. There were actual court cases about their distinctive fingernails and character details. Then, Hasbro did something even more brilliant. They didn't try to do everything in-house. They partnered with the best in the business. Sunbow Productions handled the animation. Marvel Productions and Marvel Comics handled the storytelling. And Marvel brought in this writer named Larry Hama, who basically created the entire G.I. Joe universe we know today. Larry Hama was the secret weapon. This guy understood how to create compelling characters, how to build a mythology, how to make you care about what happened to these soldiers. He's the reason the comic book was so good, and why it outlasted the cartoon by years. So you had this perfect storm. Reagan deregulated children's TV, Hasbro had a superior product with legal advantages, and they had the creative talent to make it compelling. The result? A half-hour commercial that aired 5 days a week in syndication, hitting kids with the same message over and over. You need these toys. And brother, did it work? But here's what's important to understand. This wasn't just about selling toys. Hasbro was building a universe. They were creating something that felt real, that felt lived in, that felt like it mattered. And for 3 glorious years, it was unstoppable. The Golden Age, when G.I. Joe ruled the world. From 1983 to 1986, G.I. Joe was an absolute juggernaut. We're talking $150 million in toy sales in 1985 alone, projected to hit $160 million in 1986. And get this, in 1985, the G.I. Joe comic book had 43,173 direct mail subscriptions. You know what had fewer? The Amazing Spider-Man, with only 28,017 subscriptions. Spider-Man, Marvel's flagship character, the face of the company, got beat by a bunch of cartoon soldiers. That's not just success. That's cultural dominance. And it wasn't just about the raw numbers. G.I. Joe had something that most toy lines didn't. It had staying power. Kids weren't just buying one figure and moving on. They were collecting dozens of them. They were buying the vehicles, the playsets, the whole ecosystem. Why? Because Hasbro had figured out the secret. Make each figure cheap enough that kids could afford them with allowance money. The average G.I. Joe figure cost about $1.99. Compare that to Transformers, which ranged from $5 to $8 for a basic figure. That price point meant kids could buy multiple Joes, which meant they were more invested in the line. But here's what's fascinating. The reason G.I. Joe was so good wasn't despite the restrictions placed on it. It was because of the restrictions. See, Sunbow had to follow strict content guidelines. No one could die. No blood, no real violence. They couldn't even show bullets. Everything had to be lasers. And when a plane got shot down, you always saw the pilot parachute out safely. How do you create tension in a war story where nobody can get hurt? Now, you'd think that would make the show boring, right? Wrong. Because they couldn't rely on violence to create stakes. The writers had to get creative. They set battles in deserts, mountains, underwater, in space, anywhere they could showcase different vehicles and playsets. Every episode was basically a toy catalog, but it was a good toy catalog because the variety kept you engaged. One episode, the Joes are fighting Cobra in the Arctic, and you're seeing the Snowcat and the Polar Battle Bear in action. Next episode, they're underwater, and suddenly you need the Shark Submarine. The week after that, they're in the desert with the Desert Fox and the AWE Striker. It was brilliant marketing disguised as storytelling. Or maybe it was brilliant storytelling disguised as marketing. Either way, it worked. And those PSAs at the end, those weren't just filler. They were genius. They gave parents a reason to let their kids watch. Sure, it's a toy commercial, but at least barbecue is teaching them about fire safety. Plus, let's be honest, those PSAs were actually pretty good. They taught kids about stranger danger, about not playing with guns, about looking both ways before crossing the street. Useful stuff, delivered in a way that didn't feel preachy. But the real secret weapon was Cobra. They weren't just terrorists, they were a movement. The show portrayed them as building a cult of personality around Cobra Commander by exploiting disillusionment and mistrust in government. They had corporate partnerships with Mars Industries and extensive enterprises. They had their own island nation. They had legitimate business fronts. Plus, the individual Cobra characters were fantastic. Destro was this honorable arms dealer who had his own code of ethics. The Baroness was smart, capable, and genuinely dangerous. Zartan was a master of disguise with his own biker gang. Even the low-level Cobra troopers had personality. The Crimson Guard were elite soldiers. The Vipers were specialists. The BATS were robots. Every character on both sides felt like they mattered. And that's what separated G.I. Joe from every other toy commercial on TV. It had stakes. It had depth. It had a world you could believe in. For 3 years, from 83 to 86, G.I. Joe was untouchable. 95 episodes of pure Saturday morning gold. Kids were glued to their TVs every afternoon. Parents were shelling out for figures every birthday and Christmas. Comic shops couldn't keep the books in stock. But then, 1987 happened, and everything fell apart. If you're enjoying this trip down memory lane, go ahead and smash that like button. It really does help the channel. And subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive, because I've got some good ones coming. The beginning of the end, 1987, and the Cobra Law disaster. So here's what you need to understand. Despite pulling in over $150 million a year, Hasbro was in trouble. In 1987, they reported that most of their toy lines were losing money. I know, it doesn't make sense. How can you be selling $150 million worth of G.I. Joe and still be losing money? But that's corporate accounting for you. Between manufacturing costs, licensing fees, marketing expenses, and distribution, the margins were tighter than you'd think. So they made a decision. They canceled both the G.I. Joe and Transformers animated series. Just done. After 3 years of dominance, they pulled the plug on the Sunbow partnership. This was a massive mistake, but they didn't know it yet. But it gets worse. See, in 1986, Hasbro had released the Transformers movie in theaters. And in that movie, they killed Optimus Prime. They thought it would be dramatic, emotional, a great way to clear out the old toy line and sell new characters. Instead, kids were traumatized. I'm not exaggerating. Kids were crying in theaters. Parents were furious. The backlash was so severe that Hasbro went into full panic mode. So when they made the G.I. Joe movie in 1987, they had originally planned to kill Duke. You know, the main character, the leader of the Joes. But after the Optimus Prime disaster, they chickened out. They hastily re-edited the movie, so Duke just goes into a coma and then recovers off-screen. You can tell it was a last-minute change because the dialogue doesn't quite match the animation. It's awkward and obvious, and because they were so scared of another backlash, they didn't even release it in theaters. It went straight to video. But the real problem with the G.I. Joe movie wasn't Duke's fake death. It was Cobra Law. If you haven't seen it, let me explain. The movie reveals that Cobra Commander wasn't actually the real villain. No, the real villains were an ancient race of insect people called Cobra Law, who had been secretly controlling Cobra the whole time. I'm not making this up. They introduced characters like Globulus, the leader of Cobra Law, and Nemesis Enforcer, this big bug-eyed monster thing that doesn't talk. And the whole backstory is that Cobra Law was this advanced civilization that got wiped out by the Ice Age, and now they want revenge on humanity. It was completely insane. It had nothing to do with the semi-realistic military tone that made G.I. Joe great. It was like someone watched He-Man and Conan the Barbarian and said, yeah, let's do that, but with G.I. Joe. Fans hated it. They called it lore-breaking. They said it was too outlandish. And you know who else hated it? Larry Hama, the guy who created the entire G.I. Joe universe. He straight up refused to include Cobra Law in the comic book continuity. He just ignored it completely. The movie happened, and then the comic went right back to telling stories about Cobra Commander and Destro and the Baroness like nothing had changed. When your own head writer won't touch your new characters, you know you've screwed up. And here's the thing, this wasn't just a creative mistake. This was a symptom of a bigger problem. Hasbro was desperate to sell new toys, so they kept pushing the creative team to come up with weirder, more outlandish characters. We need something new, something different, something kids haven't seen before. But the fans didn't want weird and outlandish. They wanted what made G.I. Joe great in the first place. Realistic military action with compelling characters. This is the moment where the business side and the creative side stopped working together. The business side wanted short-term sales. The creative side wanted long-term brand integrity. And when those two things are in conflict, the business side always wins. Until it doesn't. Until the brand collapses and there's nothing left to sell. The slow death. How G.I. Joe lost its soul. After Sunbow ended the series in 1986, the toy line just drifted. Without the cartoon to provide consistent storytelling, Hasbro started throwing random figures at the wall to see what would stick. They introduced characters like Crystal Ball, a hypnotist with a weird crystal ball accessory, and Raptor, a guy with a giant bird on his arm. Fans thought these characters were ridiculous, and honestly, they were right, but it got worse, so much worse. By 1988, the line had completely abandoned its military roots. Suddenly, G.I. Joe figures had vibrant colors, neon weaponry, and more monster enemies than humans. They started doing environmental themes with characters like Eco Warriors, space themes with Star Brigade, drug enforcement themes with the DEF. The figures that made G.I. Joe special, the realistic military gear, the detailed file cards, the sense that these were actual soldiers, all of that was gone. Replaced by day-glow nonsense that looked like it belonged in a different toy line entirely. I mean, look at some of these figures from the late 80s. Bright orange, neon green, hot pink. These are supposed to be elite military commandos, and they're dressed like they're going to a rave. It was embarrassing, and longtime fans knew it. Then, in 1989, Hasbro hired Dick Entertainment to make a new G.I. Joe series, and it was terrible. Where Sunbow had produced 95 episodes over 3 years with high-quality animation, Dick only managed 39 episodes over 3 years with visibly inferior animation. The budget was clearly lower. The writing was aimed at younger kids. The whole thing felt cheap. It was embarrassing. Fans who grew up with the Sunbow series felt betrayed. This wasn't the G.I. Joe they remembered. This was a cheap knockoff made by people who didn't understand what made the original special. The tone was wrong. The animation was wrong. The stories were wrong. Everything about it felt like a step down. And you can see it in the ratings and cultural impact. The original Sunbow series has a retrospective ranking of 7,088 out of 33,160 TV shows. Not amazing, but respectable for a toy commercial from the 80s. The Dick series? 15,763 out of 33,600. That's a massive drop in cultural relevance. People remember the Sunbow series fondly. People barely remember the Dick series at all. And the toy sales reflected it. By the early 90s, G.I. Joe was a shadow of its former self. The figures were sitting on shelves. Kids had moved on to Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Power Rangers, and other properties. By 1992, it was over. The toy line ended. The cartoon was canceled. The comic book limped along until 1994. But the damage was done. The franchise that had dominated the 80s was dead. And the saddest part? It didn't have to be this way. If Hasbro had just stuck with what worked, if they'd kept the quality high, if they'd maintained the creative vision, if they'd trusted their audience, G.I. Joe could have lasted for decades. But they didn't. They panicked, they chased trends, and they destroyed what made the franchise special. The real lesson: why G.I. Joe couldn't survive. So here's the thing that nobody talks about. This universe was always going to have a limited shelf life. Why? Because it's called G.I. Joe, a real American hero. That works great in the United States. It taps into patriotism, military pride, American exceptionalism. For American kids in the 80s, that was appealing. That was cool. But when you're trying to build a global franchise, when you're trying to sell toys in Europe, Asia, South America, a real American hero is a tough sell. Compare that to Transformers. Transformers is about alien robots fighting a civil war on Earth. There's nothing specifically American about it. It's universal. Good versus evil. Autobots versus Decepticons. That translates to any culture, any language, any country. That's why Transformers has had multiple successful movie franchises, and G.I. Joe hasn't. The 2009 Rise of Cobra movie made $240 million worldwide, which sounds good until you realize that's less than most Transformers movies make in their opening weekend. And they had to basically remove all the American stuff from it to make it work internationally. They made it about an international peacekeeping force instead of an American military unit. The real American hero branding that made G.I. Joe special in the 80s became an anchor around its neck in the global marketplace. But there's a bigger lesson here, and it's one that applies to any business, brand, or any creative project. When you sacrifice what made you special to chase short-term sales, you lose everything. G.I. Joe worked because it had a clear identity. Realistic military action figures with detailed backstories and compelling storytelling. The figures looked like real soldiers. The vehicles looked like real military hardware. The stories, while fantastical, had a grounding in reality. When Hasbro abandoned that identity, when they introduced bug people and neon weapons and space themes, they destroyed the foundation that made the franchise successful. And here's the brutal truth. They did it because they were scared. The Transformers movie bombed. Their toy lines were losing money. Wall Street was breathing down their necks. So they panicked and started making desperate decisions. We need new characters. We need new gimmicks. We need something to boost sales this quarter. But panic is the enemy of good decision making. When you're scared, you make short-term choices that feel safe but actually destroy your long-term prospects. Hasbro should have doubled down on what made G.I. Joe great. They should have invested in better animation, better storytelling, better quality control. They should have trusted their audience. Instead, they chased trends, cut costs, and hoped for the best, and they lost everything. You know what's funny though? The one thing that did survive from G.I. Joe, those PSAs, those cheesy little 30-second safety lessons at the end of every episode, have become more culturally relevant than the show itself. They've been parodied, memed, and referenced for decades. There's a whole generation of people who can quote those PSAs word for word. Don't play with guns. Look both ways before crossing the street. Don't talk to strangers. Why? Because they were genuine. They were trying to teach kids something useful. And even though they were mandated by regulation, the FCC required educational content in children's programming. They became a cherished part of the G.I. Joe experience. That's the irony. The thing Hasbro was forced to do by the government ended up being the most enduring part of the franchise. Maybe there's a lesson in that. Maybe the things we're forced to do, the constraints we have to work within, are actually what make us better. Maybe limitations breed creativity. Or maybe I'm just getting nostalgic in my old age. So that's the rise and fall of G.I. Joe. A franchise that only existed because Reagan deregulated children's television. That dominated the 80s by being a better toy commercial than anyone else. And that collapsed because the company lost sight of what made it special in the first place. It's a story about creative integrity, corporate panic, and the danger of chasing short-term profits over long-term brand building. And honestly, it's a story that's more relevant today than ever, because we're living in an era where every piece of media is trying to be a cinematic universe, where every product is trying to maximize quarterly earnings, where every brand is terrified of taking risks. G.I. Joe succeeded when it took risks, when it trusted its creative team, when it focused on making something genuinely good instead of just something that would sell. And it failed the moment it stopped doing those things. The lesson isn't that toy commercials are bad. The lesson is that if you're going to make a toy commercial, make it the best damn toy commercial you can. Don't cut corners. Don't chase trends. Don't panic when things get tough. Stick to your vision. Trust your audience. And never, ever sacrifice quality for short-term gains. If this brought back some memories or taught you something new about a franchise you loved, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what your favorite G.I. Joe figure was. Seriously, I read every single one. Mine was Snake Eyes, obviously, but I want to hear yours. And if you're not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? There's a lot more where this came from.